So again, my name is Karen Malek. I'm with True Consulting. I'm a planner, and we've been brought in to assist the village with developing a floodplain management bylaw. Speaking of the policy side of things. So the question may be, if you're not familiar with a floodplain management bylaw, why is a floodplain management bylaw needed? So the village of Cache Creek is situated at the confluence of the Bonaparte River and Cache Creek, as you all well know. As you've probably seen from some of the boards behind you, there's a pretty good history of flooding that's come through this area on the Bonaparte and to some extent on Cache Creek. And when they come together, it gets a bit more interesting. Flood events, we've been able to look around and track flood events recorded as far back as 1866. And I'm sure if we speak to our Indigenous neighbors, it goes well beyond that as well. Whether or not there's a lot of development, as we see it now, back in the day, floods still happen, just to varying degrees, and as we can sort of see on the board at the back of the room, more frequent than they used to be. Now, the bylaw also helps reduce the risk of injury, loss of life, and property damage, obviously from the flooding and any bank erosion that may come as a result. So that's a priority, to have a bylaw that will help take care of those matters as best as possible. And for those who are sort of policy wonks, the bylaw is authorized under Section 524 of the Local Government Act, so it gives the village the power to implement a bylaw that does just this and protects the floodplain and development within the floodplain. More specifically, the purpose of the bylaw, it aims to, again, reduce the risk of injury, loss of life, property damage from flooding by establishing, one, the minimum design and siting standards for buildings and structures, that are considered to be vulnerable to floodwaters, but also special consideration for the subdivision of land in flood-prone areas. So if we know an area is flood-prone, this mechanism can help discourage or make it undevelopable, if you will, maybe another way to put it possibly, without special provisions because of what we know about the area and the sensitivities to the land. So maybe avoid what we've seen historically, where we're building a community or development or a subdivision in an area that historically is flooded. We can try to avoid that and learn from those past mistakes. And the bylaw helps give the village some powers to do that for the betterment of the community as a whole. So just for the record, the bylaw I'm speaking of, it's in draft form. So council still has to go through the bylaw, review it, make any amendments or changes. This exercise this evening also will collect feedback, which council and the mayor will make use of. And we'll pass along. So just, if I talk it's a matter of fact, I don't mean to, it's a draft form. So just want to give that disclaimer out there. So in terms of the application of the bylaw, it applies to all lands within the village, and that's the intent of the bylaw. And it gives the approving authority, which essentially is the village and the administration, the ability to impose elements of flood control and management through one mechanism being a development permit area, which you'd find in your official community plan. Currently, there isn't one in there regarding flooding in hazard areas. So we'd be looking at amending the OCP to include a development area which would set out guidelines and provide more direction if development was to occur within defined areas. The bylaw can also kick in and apply at building permit stage, subdivision stage, and in situations where there may be justification for site-specific exemptions. So there may be instances where one can come to the village and say, I think I'm exempt, or I don't really think I'm within that area. What are my options to exclude myself if possible? So there'd be provisions in the bylaw to address that. And then other amendments to the official community plan, as well as the zoning bylaw, to incorporate and acknowledge the fact that if this bylaw does get adopted, these other policy documents that are higher up, higher level, speak to it and give direction to it. So the essence of the bylaw, and 10 points give or take, is risk reduction, climate change adaptation, professional reliance. Is anybody keeping up with the small words? No. Shared responsibility, floodway protection, development constraints, exception process, which I kind of already alluded to, the always important legal instruments, and then the enforcement and penalty components, which you'll see in pretty much every bylaw. There's always that element in the bylaws. But that's sort of the essence of what the bylaw is about. I'll get into more detail here now as we go through some more slides. In terms of flood setback areas, in the case of the minimum floodplain setback for development adjacent to a watercourse, the draft is suggesting it be 30 meters or approximately 98 feet as measured from the natural boundary. Building sites on a bluff where the toe is within 15 meters of the natural boundary or subject to erosion, setback would be 3 times the height of the bluff. In terms of a minimum setback, it's 7.5 meters required from any structure constructed for flood protection or seepage control. And then where more than one setback is applicable, the greater distance shall be required. So the idea is put some provisions in so they're a bit more as black and white as possible. So there's very little confusion on either administration's end or the developers or the residents' end when you're looking to do something on the properties. In terms of dwelling unit and floodplain setback requirements, the bylaw is recommending that basements are prohibited in new dwellings within the floodplain. Crawl spaces within new dwellings within the floodplain shall not exceed 1.2 meters or 4 feet. And no building structures or landfill shall be constructed, reconstructed, moved, extended, or located within the floodplain setback. So just be mindful, this isn't what you have now, this doesn't apply to you. You grandfathered in, right? So it's moving forward if you're coming in with new applications for development. The suggestion or the indication would be is if you're within this catchment area or this area as defined in the bylaw, these are some of the provisions that are going to be in place. Obviously, we want to discourage having habitable spaces in basements that are prone to flooding. We don't want to have risk to life. In terms of general prohibitions, there's a number that gets set out. So again, no buildings, structures, obstructions, or landfills shall be constructed, altered, moved, or extended. No parcel shall be created through subdivision unless it can be proven that it can be built and developed in accordance with the bylaw. So there may be instances in the case of a subdivision where you can add fill and it would basically make sense on an engineering perspective, or qualified professional will sign off on it and say it's done in a sound practice or sound measure, and therefore it will be it'll hold up. Development is also discouraged in debris hazard areas, and that's something that we'll get into a little bit later on in another presentation. Again, unless an exemption is granted. And then development is being prohibited within the 200-year bank erosion susceptible zone, which is, it's on some of the maps we have in the off to the room, off to my left, up to your right. And they'll give you an idea of what those zones potentially are going to look like, again, in draft form. Within the bylaw, you're going to hear what's called FCL, flood construction level. And you're going to see, if you haven't already, the maps are on the room. There's a couple of them. And they have, what you see on the screen here before you is FCL or ISO lines. So for properties within the Bonaparte River and Cache Creek floodplains, the FCL shall be the closest ISO line located upstream from the subject property. So the diagram you see here before you, we have the Bonaparte. We have you can sort of, if you can, I'm not sure how your eyes are going to work tonight from the back there, but we have a little black arrow indicating the flow. And then we have the ISO lines. So depending on where your property is, where the flow of the river is, it will help staff determine, and any other qualified professionals determine, which FCL line you have to adhere to. For properties near the water courses without floodplain mapping, and there may be some instances, I think we've captured most of it though within the village, but the FCL shall be a minimum of 3 meters above the natural boundary of the water course. And then where more than one FCL is applicable, if that is to be the case, the higher FCL shall be applied. That's erring on the side of caution, obviously. And then there's something referred to as freeboard. So the FCL line is designated flood level plus the freeboard, which represents a 0.6 meter gap between that and the water level. Another way of sort of illustrating this and what the FCL represents, we've got some dwellings here, some sitting on fill. We have one that represents sort of a suggestion that it's a mobile home, so it's up on basically up on stilts, for lack of better words, piles. And then we have sort of your typical house. Nope, excuse me. We have your typical house where we, again, no habitable space underneath. And then the other one, which is at a higher level above. Oops, excuse me. So in terms of general exemptions, so there is cases where exemptions can come into play. And I won't capture all of them. I'll just probably grab a few and you can read the rest off the screen if you can. Renovations without additions or creation or expansion of habitable areas. So if you're adding a porch, small porch to the front of your property or something like that, that would most likely qualify for an exemption. You're not creating a habitable space. It's not a large area that may possibly be able to be converted to habitable space. Same thing with carports, garages, foyers. And storage buildings, if they're not containing flood damageable or hazardous goods, may be exempt as well. Moving on to some additional exemptions. If there's underground or enclosed underground parking and unobstructed egress above the FCL and warning signs. And in the case of livestock, open-sided livestock housing would get exempted as well. So those are a couple more in addition to what you see on the screen. Now, site-specific exemptions, I've kind of alluded to that a bit earlier. The site-specific exemptions are applicable if required to vary a regulation. It's, again, site-specific. You need to come into the village and talk to village staff about whether or not what you're proposing could be site-specific and granted an exemption, or if there's certain measures you have to take to get permissions to construct. In order to do that, some of the standard stuff that you would probably be expected to submit in any case would be a scaled plan, documents and plans that would support your proposal. And there may be situations where staff may say, okay, I need some additional information. So the bylaw will have it written in there and any additional information that staff deem necessary. So they have all the information in front of them to render a decision. And then maybe a case where you need a site-specific flood assessment report by a qualified professional. And it would have to meet the appropriate guidelines at the provincial level. And as could be expected, the cost for those would be borne by the applicant. So moving on to potential conditions of approval, if you're to get an exemption. Now those conditions could apply, again, to the subdivisions, to development permits. That's tied to the development permit area I alluded to earlier in the OCP, the Official Community Plan. Could be tied to building permits, and as well as site-specific exemptions. If it's deemed appropriate or necessary, the approving authority, being the village, could require that the landowner enter into a covenant, or what some people may know as a Section 219 covenant, which basically gets registered on title, indicating that the property in question is subject or prone to flooding, and absolving the village of any liability should flooding occur on the property, as the owner acknowledges that they bear that. Now, the Village of Cache Creek does not represent that compliance with the bylaw guarantees protection from flooding or erosion damage. It's a bit of a disclaimer. And living within the floodplain is the sole responsibility and the risk of the owners and the occupants. So again, that's making sure that the information is in front of you, but the village has done everything they can to make sure that you're aware of it and to protect you and anybody else where possible. So in terms of steps forward, Council, like as I alluded to earlier, will be reviewing the draft floodplain management bylaw. There are a couple of copies on the table at the back. There's also a copy of the draft bylaw on the Flood Hub under the flood mitigation bylaw page. So if you're curious and want to read all that fun bylaw language and some legalese, please help yourself. Also, there'll be some consideration of the proposed amendments to the OCP, the zoning bylaw, and the building regulation bylaw. So when we initially started our on the project, we were looking at various policy documents that exist within the village and determining if any had to be amended or revised to take into account the fact that we'd have something called a floodplain management bylaw. Sometimes municipalities will have some language in their OCP about floodplain management, or even sometimes in their zoning bylaw. What our recommendation has been to pull it out of both documents, have the documents refer to the floodplain management bylaw, with the exception of the official community plan, which would have a development permit area dealing with flood-prone areas. And that would provide guidelines for development. So that, along with the floodplain management bylaw, hopefully provides everybody with as much guidance as possible to move forward in a responsible manner. Another step forward is a clear understanding of its provision, and it's essential for all affected parties, yourselves, council, developers, village staff, to understand the draft bylaw and what's going to come into play. And consideration for the proposed amendments, again, to the OCP. Oops, excuse me, redundant. And again, on our side of things, with regards to working with the village staff, working with mayor and council, as well as yourselves, and we'll be happy to hear any concerns you may have or any questions you may have about the draft and what that may look like or how it may affect you down the road. We take all that information to try to pull it all together as best as we can, share it with the mayor and council so they can go forward and when they consider the bylaw with as much information as possible. So finally, with regard to my presentation, the draft floodplain management bylaw, we see it as representing a significant step towards the managing of the flood and erosion risks within the village of Cache Creek. So with that, thank you for your time.